Hi, good evening. Welcome to Jotkulture's presentation on cultural appropriation versus cultural intellectual property, how to tell the difference and why it matters. I'm Jan from Jotkulture. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm excited to have you here and excited to share with you a little bit about our strategy for figuring out cultural appropriation versus cultural intellectual property and cultural appreciation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more later in the talk about our role as cultural intellectual property specialists. But first, I'm going to talk to you about cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation scandals can cost companies financially and socially, but it's not always easy to know what to do. It's not always easy to figure out where to draw the line. And the goal in today's presentation is to share how to make that a little easier. I will have a Q&A session at the end, so if you have questions, I'll do my best to answer them at the end, or you can always reach out to us separately after this talk. So the goal today is to talk about what is cultural intellectual property, so you can learn how to spot possible cultural appropriation. Know when do you need to pause and ask yourself if this might be a situation where we might be accused of cultural appropriation, or if you're working for a client where your client might be accused of cultural appropriation. To secondly, identify cultural intellectual property, where there might be some legal protection involved of a symbol or clothing or picture, for example. And finally, to learn why it matters and how to tell the difference. So what is the cost of ignoring cultural intellectual property? So this conversation seems like it's new because we're hearing a lot about companies being canceled and celebrities being canceled, whether it's Kim Kardashian with her kimono or some other controversy. But these conversations are not new. This is not really a new topic. It's just getting more attention lately. But I was first exposed to some of these cultural intellectual property issues nearly 20 years ago, working as a lawyer for the Department of Justice in Canada, working on traditional knowledge and geographical indications is when I first got involved in this question around cultural heritage and cultural appropriation. And it's definitely not new. The World Intellectual Property Organization has been working on these issues for several years as well, and continues to negotiate an international instrument, some international legal protection for what we call intangible cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional expressions, all of which is what I call cultural intellectual property. So this, I think part of what attracts me to this, just to give you a little bit of background really briefly, part of what pulls me to this topic is that I would describe myself as a bit of a transcultural misfit. So I have lived in different countries, I have worked in different language environments, and I have a cultural background that is multifaceted. As a Canadian, a Ghanaian, a Santi, now in the United States, I understand that navigating different cultural backgrounds, navigating culture can be tricky. So how can we make it easier? How can we help you to make it easier? And that's one of the goals of this short presentation this evening. So I'm going to talk to you for about 15 minutes about cultural appropriation versus cultural IP, and explain to you how there's some value in being guided by cultural IP. And when I say cultural IP, I'm talking about cultural intellectual property. Most people are familiar with intellectual property like copyrights for songs and writings, etc. Trademarks, your symbols, whether it's your Starbucks that you look for or that Costco sign that you look for, and patents, right? So those are the classic forms of intellectual property. but there's also something called cultural intellectual property. So one important point that I want to make early on in this conversation is that I'm not focused on individual personal decisions about how you wear your clothing or what you do with your hair. And I'm not saying those aren't important conversations to have, but the focus here is on commercial use. And that's where the problems tend to arise more, is on the commercial use of cultural IP, which tends to happen, it tends to be done by companies, whether large or small. And we see this a lot in the fashion industry, as you can see just from the examples that I have up on the screen. So what is cultural appropriation? When is it cultural intellectual property? And when is it time to go a little further? So I'm going to talk to you about two examples. One involves cultural appropriation, and the other one we get into cultural intellectual property. If you've been paying attention to the news at all, you may be familiar with the recent scandal that fashion brand Balenciaga has found itself in. And this is really just an example of who is paying attention, right? Who's paying attention to all this stuff and why do we care? Well, customers are paying attention. So this first example is Balenciaga, but the first bit of trouble they're in right now is not around cultural appropriation, but it is around what people think is socially appropriate and the kind of social media backlash that can really impact a company's bottom line. So just to explain to you a little bit about what happened with Balenciaga, Balenciaga ran some advertisements rather, that when people saw them, they said this appears to promote child pornography. There was a lot of outrage. People suggested that Balenciaga should be canceled. People were urging Kim Kardashian to discontinue her relationship with them. Balenciaga apologized. They then took the additional step of saying that they were going to sue, and they did launch a lawsuit, I believe, against the production company that did the marketing. So they really wanted to distance themselves from this, right? So Balenciaga was really feeling the heat, and it's not that they were feeling the heat because anyone was suing them for violating anything, but they were feeling the heat because their customers were really upset. And some people said they're not going to wear the brand anymore. So that situation generated a lot of heat for Balenciaga. Last year, their challenge was one around cultural appropriation. So the cultural appropriation scandal did not generate the same kind of attention as the child pornography situation, but they did still get some flack for the saggy pants that they put on sale, that they marketed and put on sale last year. And this was described as racist. People got upset and said that they were appropriating in this situation where they were now selling these $1,200 pants with the built-in boxers hanging down. And so why was this criticized as racist and as cultural appropriation? Well, because the saggy pants is something that had started with young Black youth, young men, and it was something that was frowned upon, and even a situation where these youth were being criminalized for wearing the saggy pants. So you have something that is associated with a particular group and they're being criminalized, they're being just characterized negatively for that particular look that is identified with the group. And then Balenciaga takes it and makes it some kind of fashion statement. So that's one example where there was an accusation of cultural appropriation. I'll talk about it a little bit more when I get into the identity model, but I want to take you to the next example. And this example involves cultural intellectual property. And here we have Marvel Studios and Disney, and they did Black Panther. So Black Panther 2 has come out recently, and people were excited when Black Panther came out because we had a Black superhero, and it represented a lot of different African cultures in terms of the clothing that was being worn, and a lot of it was beautifully put together. But the question that arose at some point around Black Panther was one involving cultural IP, because the main character, T'Challa, was wearing the Ghanaian kente, which is protected under Ghana's Copyright Act as part of Ghana's cultural heritage. And then this became a question of the commercial use of kente. So remember, we're not talking about individual uses and whether somebody decides to wear kente one day or not. This is really about commercial use, and that's where the issues get triggered. So this is bringing us to the question of cultural IP. So what is this cultural IP? So I've just told you that Ghana has protected its kente cloth, the kente cloth, as part of Ghana's intangible cultural heritage under Ghana's Copyright Act. And even though this is not law that applies in the United States, it does signal to us that there is some cultural IP. And cultural IP is on the rise. This is something that, as I said, has been discussed for several years, but it's not as though it's going away. People may not have been paying a lot of attention to it, but it is on the rise. As the World Intellectual Property has been negotiating, countries have been implementing their own domestic legislation, their own domestic laws to protect their cultural IP. And this controversy is one that you may have also come across the news. This example is from Italy. And so Italy's cultural code has received some recent attention because of a lawsuit against fashion designer Jean-Paul Gaultier and his use of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So this is another instance of cultural IP, or an example of how cultural IP is on the rise. And so it's important to recognize that cultural intellectual property, cultural IP, when we talk about it, it is something that is real. It's not just imaginary. People may be unaware because it hasn't yet received the level of international protection that classic intellectual property rights have received, but it is still a real thing. So the same way that companies will check before they use somebody else's IP, they'll check if there's copyright involved, they'll check if there are trademarks involved, and they'll take care to make sure that they're not infringing, that they're not violating somebody's rights, that they're not using without permission. The same issues can arise around cultural IP. Now, cultural appropriation is broader than cultural IP, but cultural IP can help guide us, right? It can help guide us. And this topic, as I've said, is one that is growing, and we can think about why it matters, right? What are the costs of ignoring cultural intellectual property? There are financial implications, right? So the consequences in terms of the loss of potential customers. So there are different studies about what brands are expected to do today and what customers are expecting in terms of the social implications and the social responsibility of brands, for example. And so one study, for example, says that found that 66% of American consumers want brands to take a stance on social issues. And that's why it's increasingly difficult for companies to just dismiss social critique. And Balenciaga is feeling that right now. Whether their intention was to be edgy or whatever it is, they're feeling that hit. And the social consequences, right? The social costs, because companies are increasingly expected to do the right thing. this is where we get into conversations about corporate social responsibility, and the cultural intellectual property falls into the corporate social responsibility and the social governance, because companies that lead can have a positive social impact. And finally, there could be legal implications when cultural IP is involved. So that's not to say that one has to worry that the next lawsuit is necessarily around the corner, but we do see litigation involving Italy's cultural heritage laws. It's important also to mention that there are other kinds of cultural protection that are more globally recognized, like geographical indications. And I can't get into too much detail about geographical indications today, but the European Union has expanded its protection there to cover crafts and European heritage products. And so this cultural IP is on the rise. And that means questions around use of cultural names and cultural identities and cultural products are a reality that is here to stay. At the same time, we don't want to just wipe out cultural diversity from branding and fashion, et cetera. We don't want to get rid of all sharing. So we don't want to just say, no, that's cultural, just stay away from it, right? So how do we figure it out? How can we make it a little bit easier? And what we do at Jotkulture is we use an identity model. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about this identity model to help you pause and say whether or not you're more likely to be engaging in appropriation, appreciation, or if you need to pause and say, there's a cultural IP issue here. So the identity model can help us distinguish, and it's important because ultimately, this question about cultural appropriation is really about identity, and it's about dignity, and it's about power. So first of all, if you're dealing with something that is a symbol of cultural identity or cultural resistance, that's when you stop and say, okay, that's a symbol that is culturally related. It's some kind of cultural representation. Maybe we need to stop and think about how are we going to use it or how are we dealing with it? And so just applying it to the Balenciaga saggy pants example, where they did get some social media backlash and some public criticism. So if you think about it there, the saggy pants, yes, we can certainly say that is a cultural representation. People associate the saggy pants with the young Black men, and that's where it came out of. And then we might ask, is there a history of oppression or exclusion? Well, I would say that criminalizing people for wearing saggy pants is certainly an indication that the people that have been using that, wearing that are represented, have suffered some sort of oppression or exclusion. And then you might ask, in that three-step process, what is the impact on the dignity of the source community? So if it's the kind of thing that people are going to receive positively because you're somehow affirming them or something, that's more likely to go towards appreciation than appropriation. And thinking about the particular saggy pants example, people were mad, they were upset because you're talking about something that you're talking about taking something that has been a source of sort of exclusion, of being insulted, of being criminalized, right? Something that is a style that's associated with young Black men, and then selling a version of it for $1,200. And so that is something that people found, yes, offensive, that it's having a negative impact on the dignity of the source community. And then as you're going through the steps, right? So if it's a cultural symbol, we have some history there. We've thought about what is the impact of the dignity on the source community. We might have cultural appropriation, but that doesn't mean we have cultural intellectual property. When we have cultural intellectual property, we have legal protection for the cultural heritage. Now, where there's cultural intellectual property, that's where you need to do possibly further research and engage in collaboration, and that's where cultural intellectual property expertise can help with branding so it doesn't come off as theft or as abusive use of intellectual property. So I've taken about 20 minutes. I'm just going to conclude, so I'm 5 minutes over my anticipated time. What I was going to do today is to talk to you about how to spot cultural appropriation. So hopefully you have some sense of when you might need to pause and ask yourself if this is a situation where we might be accused of cultural appropriation. Is it a symbol of cultural identity or resistance, right? Is there some history of oppression? And then also, hopefully, you come to understand where you might identify cultural intellectual property, recognizing that there may be some legal protection involved. And that requires some additional research in the same way one might check for possible trademark infringement. You can check for cultural intellectual property. And that's not to say that you're going to be sued today, but the legal protection puts you on notice that there is some kind of claim. And finally, in terms of how to tell the difference, which was the last thing that I was going to share with you this evening, I talked a bit about the cost of ignoring cultural IP, and then also the difference really comes down to where there's a legal basis. But note importantly that the law in this area continues to develop. So socially conscious companies will want to get ahead of the game and lead in this area. This is an important and growing area, and it's one that any company that's serious about their corporate social responsibility and their social governance will want to pay attention to. So I'm Jan from Jotkulture. Hopefully I've given you some better understanding of how you might differentiate cultural appropriation from cultural IP. If you have any questions, please put them in Q&A, or I'm happy to have any meetings with anybody who has further comments or questions, and you can book that on our site at www.jotkulture.com. Let me see if I have any questions in the Q&A.